and thank you for joining us. My name is Stephanie Sunata. I am the outreach producer for the new Quinn Films documentary, For the Left Hand. Now, this documentary tells the story of pianist Norman Malone, who found a love for music very early on in childhood. But tragically, at age 10, he was paralyzed on his right side. This did not stop him from dedicating his life to learning to play with just his left hand and foot. The film catches up with Norman decades later when he prepares for his concert debut at age 78. The film's co-director, Quinn, and producer and writer Howard Reich are very familiar with working with each other, though. They've teamed up together previously on another Quinn production, Prisoner of Her Past. In that film, Howard is at the center, trying to piece together what happened to his mother during the Holocaust. It has been broadcast more than 500 times in 140 plus markets. Prisoner of Her Past is set to have a special broadcast in correlation with the Holocaust Remembrance Day. You can see the film on May 1st on Chicago's PBS station, WTTW. To mark this event, I'm very honored to be joined with Howard and Gordon to discuss both these films and their working together. So thank you so much both for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess a lot has happened between both films. So maybe we could start at the beginning on how you both met and kind of intertwined.
Well, so I did a story in the Chicago Tribune in 2003 titled Prisoner of Her Past. And as you say, it was about my search to find out what happened to my mother during the Holocaust. She never told me, but a couple years earlier, she had begun, in effect, reenacting her Holocaust childhood. She said people were trying to kill her. She believed there was a yellow Star of David on her clothes, and she was in a state of extreme paranoia. I tried to figure out what happened. I went to Poland, I went to Ukraine. I pieced the story together as best I could. The story ran on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. It was a special section also. And the reaction I got to that was overwhelming. Hundreds of emails from across the country and around the world. And when that story ran, people started telling me, you should turn this story into a book and you should turn it into a film. A book I know how to do. A film I had no idea how to do. So I checked with John Calloway, who then was a leading voice on the PBS station in Chicago, WTTW, who'd had me on his show before. And I told him about the story, and he said, you should take this story to my friend Gordon Quinn at Quinn Films and see what he says. So I contacted Gordon, and I came to Gordon. I didn't know, I'd never made a film before. I didn't know what you're supposed to do. I just met Gordon, and then Gordon took it from there.
I think we met with Joanna Rudnick, who became the producer, who had already done a film or was doing a film with Quinn. And I had read the story in the paper, so I was familiar with it. And I thought that it had great potential to be a film that is not another Holocaust film, but a film that also was getting at the consequences of trauma in children's life. And I think about it now with what's going on in Ukraine, and there are all of these children who are going through a war. And so, that's what really intrigued me about the story in the beginning. And I think that is still an important part of the film. But as the story unfolded, as we got more and more involved with Howard, we began to realize that Howard himself was a character in his own film. He's in the newspaper articles, but not quite in the same way because it's more in the first person. But when we're looking at Howard functioning in our film, going to Ukraine, being driven to kind of find out what happened to his mother and running into the frustrations that we ran into in that part of the story, it became, in a sense, a different framing of the story with Howard and his mother, in a sense, as the two major characters.
Yeah, Howard, when you decided, hey, I'm going to meet with this filmmaker, did you know that you were going to be such a major part of the film?
No, and I was quite reluctant. In fact, I now recall when I wrote the first draft of the story for the Tribune and handed it into my editors, I didn't use the word I, and I referred to Mrs. Sonia Reich. And my editor is saying, wait, this is your mother. You've got to address this as your mother. You get into that. And for a journalist who's been writing in third person, for the past 30 odd years I had at that point. That was a tough thing to climb. So next, when I came to, I was not looking for a film career in any way. I just saw, is everybody right that this is a story for the screen? I did not expect to play. I just wanted to have the story told is all. To my mother, it was my fault that she was in this situation. And she did not understand the situation. I did not understand the situation, and the doctors didn't understand the situation.
And I'm absolutely not crazy. I was born in Europe. The state brought me over. I went to work and I went to night school. I tried to do my darnest best I could. And of course, we married and that one was born.
I spent years, decades really, finding the story in other people's lives. Now my own mother was having a breakdown, and I had to find her story.
Howard, all of your books and films have come from written pieces before. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about how the process was translating this from a written story into a film?
Well, to me, it was a complete education because I had never worked on a film before. So I felt, even though I was being guided by Gordon and Joanna, or I should say they were leading the charge here, but what I learned from the process is that although we're telling roughly the same story in the Tribune or on the screen, we're telling it very differently. On the page, there's a lot of exposition, there's a lot of detail. This happened on this date. So it's a very literal, almost buttoned down, reserved way of telling the story. To me, when it's on screen, most of those details are gone. We're not getting into the minutia of what happened when in World War II. To me, it's a much more visceral, emotional experience. You see it and feel it rather than cerebrally studying it. And so I like to think of these as two sides of the same coin. And I don't think my mother's story is told fully either way. It's a composite that really will give you the idea of what it is. But there is nothing to compare to seeing and hearing it on a screen with music, with dialogue. To me, that is the most all-encompassing way of telling a story.
And Gordon, were there difficulties or any challenges in translating it from the page to the screen?
Well, in a sense, the biggest challenge was finding the story that would have, like in an hour, that emotional payoff. Who's going to go through something? Who's going to be changed in some kind of way? And in the film, it's Howard that goes through a change. The journalist and the son wants to know what happened to his mother. And there's a lot of that in the newspaper article, but there was a big chunk that he could never find out. And on this trip, he thought maybe he would find it out. But the thing that really landed and we began to see was that, in a sense, what really happened to her was not the right question. And the question that Howard, I think, finally lands on, and you see him coming to terms with that, is that he's never going to find out what happened to his mother, but he finds out who his mother is, and he learns some lessons about survival. And despite all of the things and the difficulties that she had, that she was a survivor, and coming to terms with that, I think, and that's probably some of what attracted Howard initially to the story of Norman Malone.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into the current film, For the Left Hand. Years later, Howard, what made you think, after writing this series of articles, go back to Gordon, go back to Cartemquin, make another film?
So the Tribune story about my mother ran in 2003. The stories about Norman ran in 2015. So that's 12 years later. Readers of the Tribune started telling me that they saw parallels between my mother's story and Norman's story, which I never thought of as I was working on the Norman story, but it's so true. Both were 10 years old, innocents at 10 years old. Both suffer severe tragedy and trauma, and both try to and to varying degrees succeed in rebuilding and surviving. So there was already this connection. So I ran the stories in the Tribune on Norman, and I thought that was the end of the story. I did a series on him. And then the surprise came about a week after the stories appeared in the Tribune on the front page. Norman started getting invitations to give concerts for the first time in his life at age 78. And when I saw it, and he's told me about this, and he said he was saying yes to all the invitations. And when he said yes, I thought, this is a film, because now something is happening. What I had before was sort of a conceptual historical piece. Now something was going to happen. So of course I went directly to Gordon. Now I knew Gordon. I didn't need an intermediary. I had some credibility. And I showed Gordon the story on the screen, on the iPad. And I remember one of the first things that Gordon asked me. He said, did Zbigniew take these photographs? So that's Zbigniew Zak, the great Tribune photographer who did all the photography on Prisoner of Her Past, also did the whole Norman story with me. And he's a great photographer. And I said, yeah, and Gordon, I think you seem to be interested in this story right away.
Yeah, and also that Zbigniew had been filming all of the interviews, all of the things that there was enormous wealth of material when we started. The other thing that was a bit unusual, and this is something also that I think right at the beginning we brought Diane Kwan in as producer, who also produced Minding the Gap. And Norman had this concert set up where he's going to be playing with an orchestra, which immediately it was like, that was his lifelong dream, to be playing this piece, the Ravel, that becomes a character in a way in the film. And it was going to be happening pretty soon. And so we had to get that together really fast. I actually couldn't go. And I know that Diane was able to go and kind of coordinate everything. And we had several people there. And of course, Zbigniew and Howard, and were able to film Norman playing with an orchestra, the Ravel, this piece that he'd been practicing for his whole life. And I think we knew that was in some ways the end of the movie, which was the first thing we shot. And the other thing that I've only realized recently that attracted me to this, I've always been interested in groups of people who work together. I'm someone people say, oh, well, that's just a lot of meetings. And I'm like, meetings to me are drama. We have some old films, Taylor Chain, The Last Pullman Car. These are films about labor struggles. They're all about meetings. And groups of people coming together in that way to do something like an orchestra. I've always been fascinated by orchestras, by musical groups, by the way in which people kind of reach a level that they could never reach as an individual to create something. And so the fact that it was an orchestra and that is a part of it is, to me, like one of those subtexts. And it's so great that it's a community orchestra, and that Richard actually is able to talk a little bit about what community orchestras mean and that kind of thing. So I hope that the film will be seen as a great kind of acknowledgement of the important role of the arts, both in education, but also in the community.
Yeah, sounds a lot like, filmmaking, it's a team process.
Absolutely.
And so many different roles. Howard, you had mentioned earlier some of the parallels between your mother's story and Norman's. Could you maybe elaborate a little more, about the trauma or other parallels that are drawn between the two stories and the two films?
Sure. So it's really quite remarkable. Both of these people, Norman and my mother, were children who, as I said, faced extreme trauma. And both of them, after the trauma, had additional obstacles put in their way. My mother came to the United States at age 16 years old, didn't know English, didn't know anybody, had a few relatives from whom she was somewhat alienated. She had made very little money. It was just adversity after adversity. She had to climb a lot of mountains and somehow persevered. Norman too, after he suffered this injury, so many obstacles. He wanted to still be a pianist, playing with his left hand. And when he went to the Chicago Public Schools to get help in this, they signed him up for a psychological evaluation. Like, you must be crazy if you think you can play with one hand. They were too ignorant musically to know that there'd been over 100 years of music already written for left hand alone. Norman was not the first person ever to be in this situation. So like my mother, Norman had to summon up the wherewithal to make it happen for himself. So just as my mother came to the United States alone, Norman got on a bus, went from the south side of Chicago to downtown to find himself a piano teacher. No one's going to help him. He was going to do it himself. And he found one. And he found a job and a career. And one thing I like to say is that I prefer not to view my mother's life as this great tragic event, but as looking at more the beautiful American life she did get to live here. She came here, she married, she had 2 kids, she had grandkids. She lived a beautiful, and does live a beautiful American life. Norman too, tremendous setbacks. He had a wife, kids, grandkids, beloved by his students who he's taught for over 30 years. I often tell people that if you met Norman today and didn't know his story, you'd say nothing bad ever happened to this guy in his life. He's the most optimistic, life-affirming person. So to me, these are both triumphant stories to varying degrees, despite all.
That's great to hear and really inspiring, even though, we try to not frame it as an inspiring story, but you can't help but feel that way. I also feel like there might be some parallels for you, Howard, and Norman as well. First off, being, your love of music. I mean, even in Prisoner of Her Past, you do talk about that.
So as I say in Prisoner of Her Past, growing up in a family that's 100% Holocaust survivors is an intense experience. Everyone is pissed off, and for good reason. They are mad and they're yelling all the time. And to me, that was a lot of dissonance in our house. And I found my escape from it in music, because when I was pounding away on that piano, I could not hear all that yelling. And music just was my balm. It was another place I could go to in a house that had a lot of trauma. And music always has been the answer for me. I don't know what the question is, but the answer is always music. And I retired about a year ago from being a longtime critic at the Tribune, but I always would say that to me, the best time in the day is 8:30 or 9 p.m. when I'm sitting in the seat and the music is about to start. Because to me, even if it's a not great concert, it's a great event. That music comes and washes over you, and you can't be anyplace else. You are inside that music. And I think that was the case for Norman as well. Norman says in our film somewhere, he says, music is a way of surviving. And Norman had to find a way of surviving what happened to him. And music was and continues to be his way of holding his life together, I feel.
It's what he does. I mean, it's one of the things that Howard says in the film, which always caught my attention, is that like, oh, I've been seeing this guy for years. Why? Because Norman goes to almost as many concerts that Howard was when he was a full-time critic. If he's not playing music, he's going to listen to somebody else play. And I think that, you mentioned Stephanie, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about, why we don't want the film to just be an inspirational story.
Yeah, and I think it's been because it's what Cartemquin does really well, and why I love Cartemquin films, in that we've talked about this a lot, that Norman is not the most polished musician. He's not even the most polished left-handed musician. He's not world famous. He's not touring with London Symphony Orchestra or Chicago Symphony. He's the guy down the street, but the stakes for him are just as high, and the audience and people are empathetic enough to understand what these stakes are. He dedicated his life to doing this, and he had the gumption to stick with it, which not all of us have, but we could relate to. And I think that's kind of what a lot of the stories as well are, that are coming out of documentaries that we're all drawn to these days. It's those personal stories. And again, like I said, I feel like Cartemquin has been doing it for a while. Even Gordon, you mentioned your earlier films and stuff, the individuals at the center of these meetings, and at the center of these talks were still a highlight. You know, we were following the people who dreams were following the people of it, not the big systematic, like, you know, growing up in Southside Chicago and trying to be a basketball player, just like what Norman's doing and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think you see it. Norman wants that. He's an educator. He taught music for 35 years in the public schools. And as the film has been released, all of these people are coming to our screenings who were Norman's students, who he meant so much to, and he was so, so important in their lives in paying attention to them and wanting them to be the best that they can be. He held them to the same kind of demands that he had for himself, and that enabled them to really grow as students and as young people growing up. And that's also, it was a very important part of the film when we were crafting it, and I wanted to make sure it was there. And it's been very gratifying to see his students turn out in this way and kind of, validate that.
People? Yes, yes.
Barbara Pratt? Remember, used to call me Uber Patoonie.
86, 87, 88, 89, 4 years in your choir.
Wow. Aaron,
Yeah.
Aaron. And I remember that pool on.
Oh, yeah.
So excited.
The audience didn't know what the hell was
They didn't
going
know
on.
what was going on.
Because
They
we
were
cut it
just-
short.
Right, and they were just like, what? Oh, it must have been, right,
Yes,
right.
yes, yes.
You stood up for me when I had only one credit and I wanted to come back to school, and you saved me. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, yes.
My name off because I told them you wouldn't remember me and I wasn't going to say who I was. And I'm just coming by just to see what's going on.
Who are you?
I'm not
When word got out that they were having this choir, I told my wife, I have to be a part of that. There's no way I would miss it. 40 years later, it's still in me. It hasn't left.
That kind of brings me again to more of the filmmaking kind of side. Howard being personally involved in the first documentary, kind of being thrown in there and learning about that. As filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, we completely understand that asking somebody to share intimate details of their lives is no small task. Did that experience being on the other side of the camera shape how you approached Norman, or was he just like, yeah, let's just film it?
I think what happened with the Norman story is what happens with a lot of big major projects I've done at the Tribune through the years, which is at the beginning, you don't know it's going to be a big story. You don't even know if it's going to be a story. As we say in the film, I coincidentally heard about Norman's story. I set up to meet him. He invited me to his apartment, and he gave me a short version of what happened to him when he was a kid, when he was 10 years old. And being a longtime journalist, I was very skeptical that this story was true. In Chicago journalism, we have this saying, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So Norman told me the story. I immediately went to check it out. And I went to Northwestern University Library, and I went through old reels of microfilm of the Chicago Defender to see if there's any story that this really happened. And I found one, a little clip, and it's in the film. I thought, wow, this story is true. Still, I didn't know if it was going to be a story. And I kept coming back week after week to interview Norman. And Zbigniew, as Gordon said, was videotaping all the interviews. And Zbigniew didn't tell me this until much later, but Norman told Zbigniew, as we're doing these interviews, that he didn't know if he could continue. He didn't know if he could keep doing this. Reliving this was very difficult for him, but he persevered and he did do it. And so the story kept snowballing. And then I realized I couldn't tell this as one story. I had to tell it as 3 stories. And then it was supposed to run in the feature section, in the arts section of the Tribune. And the arts editor showed it to the managing editor so that maybe we could get a little promo on page 1. And the manager said to the arts editor, I'm taking this for page 1, which was not great news for the arts editor because now he needed 3 new stories to fill the space that this was supposed to fill. But it was great news for me and Norman. So that put it on the front page. So it just kind of snowballed. Similarly, the story about my mother, I didn't know that was going to be a big story either. In fact, I didn't even propose that being a story about my mother. That was supposed to be a story about late onset post-traumatic stress disorder. But then we found out that the best way to tell the story was with my mother because you had an actual diagnosed case. So it became kind of different. And I'll just say one other thing. I spent almost a year working on the story, about a year working on the story on my mother. I was working on it so long for the Tribune and so deeply, I in effect forgot I was doing a story. I wrote it up. I forgot that this was for the real world anymore. I was just deep into this. And then one day the editors invited me to this big page 1 meeting room where they had all the proofs of the story laid out as it was going to appear on the front page. And I walk into this room and I see these stories on the page of the Tribune. My heart almost stopped. Like, what? We're telling this to everybody? I was going to be revealing this thing. And so that was getting over it. The only thing that made me nervous about revealing a personal story was I didn't know what it would be like to film my mother, because if she didn't want to be filmed, she wouldn't be. But Gordon, I think you saw that she was pretty receptive to you.
Well, there are lots of ethical questions about filming somebody who is really not competent to give consent. And Howard had told us that with the doctor, she was living in a nursing home, and that she would throw people out. She would just get paranoid. She would throw them out, get away from me, So Howard brings us, me and Joanna are there, and I think we're the only ones who came in. And I think, she, particularly Joanna, I think she kind of connected to, she saw that we were Jewish, and she decided for whatever reason that we were okay. But when we were filming her, asking her anything about her past, off limits. She just wouldn't go there. She wouldn't answer it. She'd turn the story into what she wanted to talk about. But I still had misgivings about, Howard is really her, has her power of attorney. He was going to be the one signing the release. That raised a lot of questions for me. And at one point we're filming tape and my tape runs out. And I take the camera off of my shoulder and we're going to put another tape in the camera. And she stops mid-sentence where she is. She stops talking. She watches while I get the camera set up and I put it back up. And she picks up her story right where she was. And that's when I know, okay, she knows everything that's going on. And she even, one day I came with a different camera. And she said, you have a different camera, So she was very sharp and very, which is one of the things that you get with post-traumatic stress. She always knew what was going on around her. And I felt like in her way, she was complicit with the film. But we have a line in the book that I've always loved, when Howard says, look, he's got the book that's about her. And he's like showing it to its mother. And she's like, you didn't write a book. I don't believe it.
First of all, I don't believe that you wrote a book.
This is the book that I
This
wrote.
is the book. I don't believe that you wrote a book.
Do you recognize that picture on the front?
No.
But those questions, I think, are terribly important and terribly important with someone who is not in a position to consent or even to understand the power relationships that are involved in consent. When I was very young and I was doing my first film, Home for Life, I happened to be in an old age home. That was where our first film was done. And I'm filming an 83-year-old woman, and she, in the middle of the scene that is at the heart of the film, it's the laundry scene. I won't go into the details, but it's just like, she's like, oh, I don't want to be in the movie anymore, And the camera goes dark. I turn off the camera. We're filming double system. This is film and the audio keeps going. The person doing the sound didn't turn the sound off. And you hear me, this 22-year-old, explaining to this 83-year-old how important it is for her to be in the movie. And she's struggling and having a hard time, but that showing this will help the home to do a better job with helping people to adjust, blah, 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 blah. And finally, she's like, oh, okay, I'll be in the movie. And when I talk about that experience, one of the things that I say is, at 22 or 3, I didn't realize what I had done there. I had all the power. She probably thought I worked for the home. She didn't know, and she had no power. And so you have to take responsibility for those things. As a way, as a 23-year-old, I didn't. I did get a tremendous kick. I had extremely bad COVID in March of 2020. I got it very early, wound up on a ventilator, and the doctor who was about to extubate me, a young woman, actually a dermatologist, but she's volunteering in the crisis. She's volunteering in the intensive care. And we have a drama over DNR. I want to be DNR, and she has her reasons why she doesn't want me to be. And we're going back and forth about this. And she Googles me, she looks me up. And the thing that pops up is an article I wrote about this experience in Home for Life, the story that I just told you. And she was like, oh my God, here I am. I'm a doctor in my 20s dealing with this, 78-year-old guy around his wishes. She did eventually convince me not to be DNR.
Fortunately, I just want to say too about the ethical question about filming my mother. I would like to say that I asked every doctor who was working with my mother and some rabbis, everybody, is it okay for me to do this? And everyone said I should do this. No one said no. So that's why I felt it was okay to proceed.
And, one of the things that Norman has talked about in For the Left Hand, or when we have these Q&As, Norman will say, it's like, and he's with a therapist, he says that the whole experience has been kind of something for him. He doesn't exactly say it's been healing, but he talks about it in a way that he's aware of what he got into, and he's aware of, in some ways, how I think he feels it's been good for him.
Yeah. I feel that's a strong theme for a lot, in For the Left Hand. His son, talks about learning about it. In Prisoner of Her Past, you go down to New Orleans after Katrina and, talk about, the oral histories and stories just seem so important in our society, not just documenting history.
That's a great story where I'm doing all this research because we want to get that thing of young people being traumatized by war or by violence. And I'm looking for someplace, I'm looking in Somalia or I found some people who are doing some work with traumatized children in other war zones. And Howard just mentions to me casually, oh yeah, he's going to New Orleans. He's going to do something about and you had met those people already, right? They were.
Yeah, I knew the Osofskis from previous stories.
And they were working with, these high school girls who had been through the hurricane and been traumatized. And it was like, great, we're on our way to New York. It was like, it was right under our nose. But sometimes you think, well, what happened in Katrina was incredibly traumatizing for people. And in some ways, very much, one part of Howard's mother's trauma had to do with being Jewish and what was happening to Jews. And in Katrina, it had to do with being Black and what happened to African Americans in that situation. And these kids were aware of that. And so it just was like perfect, but it just fell in our lap.
Yeah, because even as we were working on this film, we all felt we have to find some way at this film to bring it into the present. This must not just be a history piece.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is an interesting correlation as well, like bringing, Gordon, you had mentioned earlier about art and democracy, or, Howard using music as kind of your way and escape. I love the kind of scene in Prisoner of Her Past where you're looking for your aunt in New York and you just happen to meet a gentleman who says that he's her student. And he says that he was doing The Godfather. He shows you the musical score. You're like, make this very brief comment like, oh, this is normally in E minor. I don't know if just offhanded comment. And then you immediately have your notepad and you're jotting down his name. And it was just very fun to see that part of, you just kind of showing on film. I was like, that is definitely Howard, the Howard I know. Yeah. So it seems like just music and those arts are really ingrained in who you are. So maybe Howard, if we could start with you on, how music has, you talked about your early relationship with it, maybe how has it evolved as you've gone from the 16-year-old kid in your house to a music critic?
So yeah, I think that scene that you mentioned proves the following point. Once a critic, always a critic. You hand me a score, I'll have commentary on it, whether you want it or not. Well, I've just been immersed. When I was 16 years old, I went downstairs one night and I turned on the TV, and this movie was just starting, and it was An American in Paris. And it was music by George Gershwin, choreography by Gene Kelly, piano virtuosity by Oscar Levant. I thought, this is it. This was the answer, And immediately I started taking piano lessons, and ever since then I've been immersed in music. And the first few years of my life, of my career, playing music, and then ever since then writing about it. So to me, music is constantly playing in my life, whether it's actually on the radio or in the back of my mind. I think I view the world through what I hear before what I see. Possibly because I had eye surgery when I was quite young, and my vision has always been somewhat impaired. And so my sense of hearing is rather heightened. And so music is just an inescapable part of my life. And so I thought, even as I was watching Prisoner of Her Past today to kind of refresh my memory about it, there's Gershwin's music, there's pictures of Frank Sinatra, there's Von Freeman, I just can't help but getting this in. It just permeates my whole existence. I'll just say one final thought of that. A friend of mine used to say, critics are not hired, they're born. And it's a certain kind of sensibility that you have, that you've got, for some reason, all these beliefs and feelings about music. And so I just express it now, instead of by playing the piano, I've done it really by playing the key, a different kind of keyboard, which you see me pecking out in Prisoner of Her Past, but it's the same impulse, embracing music.
Yeah. And Gordon, you've mentioned you don't play an instrument, but you have done, previous films about other artists and other musicians, and you are an artist yourself with filmmaking. Was it a conscious decision early on to make music a character, as you mentioned in For the Left Hand? And then follow up, kind of, why is it important to have music, even if you're not a musician, to get people like myself who don't play instruments still invested in these stories?
Well, let me answer the second part first. Yeah, I was the only one in our team who didn't play the piano. Leslie, the co-director, played the piano. Leslie was the editor, and then Matt Latterback became the second editor, and he also played the piano. Diane, our producer, played the piano, and of course, Howard actually used didn't you audition at Northwestern with the Ravel?
I didn't audition, but I performed it at Northwestern. Yeah.
And I think the idea of the importance of the Ravel is something that came in the course of making the film. We saw how important it was in Norman's life. And then I really kind of like the idea of a piece of music, almost like in some of our other films, other things become a character a little bit. And I like the idea of this piece of music and this through line of the music, the audience kind of understanding not only how it affected Norman, but other people in the world. And, sort of the bigger question about, for me, I think it's an aspect of many of the films that I've been involved in that have to do with the arts in some way. The arts are a critical part of a democracy. They're not an extra. It's why I'm so passionate about arts in the public schools and in education. It's not like, oh, well, that's nice, and you'll learn to play the piano too. The arts are part of being a citizen in democracy. And when you look at totalitarian states, they very often, the first people they go after are the artists, the avant-garde, the people who are on the dialectical forefront of, kind of social movements and thinking about how we sort of confront what's going on around us. And so I think that, well, I think in both films, music was terribly important. And, it's Prisoner of Her Past is probably not the only Holocaust film with a jazz score, but we had this one piece of music that my partner, Jerry Blumenthal, I think, brought into it, right? It was Jerry,
Yep.
By Ornette Coleman, called Lonely Woman. That was the name of the piece. And we put it in some of our demos, and it was like, oh my God, this is perfect. We probably will never be able to afford this, but we have to find a jazz composer. And Howard eventually helped us find
Jim Trumpeter.
Who became the composer, who did an incredible job. But there was one thing that he could not recreate, and that was this Ornette Coleman piece of music. And Joanna did it. Howard, is a journalist, so he's like, you cannot use my name, you can't mention me, nothing, because he knows Ornette Coleman, but he couldn't even do the introduction. And Joanna kind of pursued it and let us use it for a price that we could afford. And I think it's so important in the film that we have this very particular piece of music that is getting at some kind of essence that has to do with what Howard's mother was.
And I would say that I'm happy to say that Ornette Coleman, who's this jazz giant, after Joanna put in the request and sent a little clip of the film with that score, we got approval within 3 days.
Yeah.
And Ornette Coleman came to our New York premiere of the film. Ornette Coleman was at that, and he saw the film, and that means so much to me.
That's amazing. I think it also just shows how much music plays in our lives, even if you're not a musician or a music critic. You can appreciate it, and also, as Gordon said, like, use it as an outlet of creativity or protest or therapy, even, and really speaks true. Howard, I did want to, kind of bring up, given all the social things and, using things as social issues, if I'm sure you're following what is going on in Ukraine, and would love to kind of hear your thoughts, and if you have, contacts, and if your family's still there and if they're safe.
So I don't have family members in Ukraine. The city where my mom grew up or had her childhood is in Ukraine now, but when she was growing up, it was in Poland. The borders were changed after the war. But as I see all these horrible scenes on TV of this carnage, of all this brutality, all this needless violence, it looks just like where my mother is from. The people look like that. The ground looks like, the houses look like, it's the same thing. And it's the same thing happening. To me, this is just like World War II, minus perhaps the specific genocide of Jews back then. Other than that, it's the same kind of territorial conquest at the expense of humanity. And so it's extremely painful for all of us to watch, but for us I went there twice, once for the film, once for the story. It's the backdrop of my family's history. And I grieve that this story has to be relived again.
And we were in the West, we were in Lviv, and we were even a little bit west of there, and it was Ukraine at that time, and it was right in the midst of the Orange Revolution.
Right. The
It was-
election was the day after we left.
Yeah, and so we were meeting all these people, and of course that was one of their strongholds in the country. But it was like at the same one time we're making this film about the past of Ukraine and Ukrainians. And there's that incredible moment on Shevronai Hill, you know, where the woman is telling us about witnessing the massacre of the Jews. And the translator kind of mistranslated. He's either mistranslating or he's covering it up. You know, he's saying, yes, it was the Germans. And she's like, corrects him. She says, no, it was us. It was the Ukrainian police who were doing it. We did it. And so there is that past. My family also probably, you know, several generations back was from Ukraine, although we had no connection to it, nobody, but that's where we think we came from. But yeah, it's just been very powerful and emotional because in a sense, we met these people who were like, you know, so excited about democracy and about, you know, being in control of their own fates. And you could tell who they were, these young people. They were like artists, they were like us, they were us, you know, and they all had on these, I remember when we did the thing in the little television studio in the basement there in Dubno, they gave us like yellow armband, or the, you know, the orange armbands and stuff.
Yeah, when we got there, when we arrived in this little town that my mother's from, it caused a sensation. You know, we arrived in our big green bus and people are walking off the bus. It's like, you know, the Fellini-esque crew. And then they meet within a half an hour. They were saying, will you come on TV tomorrow to talk about what you're doing? So we were on Good Morning Dubna, in effect.
Wow. I mean, I think that also bringing back to the film's log line and that quote that Norman says, music is a way of surviving, you know, not only applies to personal survival, but kind of, as Gordon, you said, survival of democracies, survival of just societies and groups as a whole. So I guess my last question would be for each of you to maybe just give a little thoughts on what that phrase means to you. What is music is a way of surviving after making all these films and having these careers?
Well, for me, it's literally true. I did not experience I'm fortunate, I did not experience the trauma of either Norman or my mother. I've been very close to the trauma because of my mother. My mother, by the way, is still very much alive. She's going to be turning 91 next month. She's apparently indestructible. They've tried. She cannot be destroyed. So she's still here to torment me and delight me. So to me, maybe that's part of the reason music has been so important to me, because with so much trauma echoing in our house, music was a way of dealing with it. And maybe that indeed helped me relate to Norman because of my connection to music and my connection to my mother's trauma.
You know, many years ago, I think I've told you this, a Chicago filmmaker made a film about the children of Holocaust survivors and kind of the effect that it had on him. And I know, Stephanie, you were trying to do a film about the Japanese Americans who were rounded up and put into essentially concentration camps in this country. And you know, when you look at something like what's going on in Ukraine, so senseless and so horrific, it does remind you that even in the midst of the worst kinds of situations, people are striving to make art. It's a fundamental, I think, human drive, and that process, that making, that engaging with trying to tell a story, paint a painting, compose a piece of music, to play it, to sing a song, all of that connects you to the rest of the world. And so I think it's that is what the human spirit is, that making.
Well, couldn't end on a more, positive note given everything that's going on in the world. So thank you both for having a conversation with us and, for making your art and letting us enjoy it with you. So Prisoner of Her Past is set to air on May 1st on Chicago's PBS station, WTTW. It will actually be the 12th year in a row that it has been aired on the station. For the Left Hand is currently in the midst of our outreach and impact campaign, and you can learn more at forthelefthand.com.
Both films have DVDs. Prisoner of Her Past and For the Left Hand has a DVD that will be coming out soon.
Yeah. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And thanks again, Howard and Gordon.